Khorne here, and today I wanted to clear up some of the biggest misconceptions surrounding Total War Warhammer 3. As it always surprises me how uninformed people are, considering that the game has been out for 4 years now, and yet somehow we are still thinking of it as though it is Warhammer 2. Now, the main reason I'm making this video is just to try and clear up these misconceptions, as I am getting tired of reading them non-stop in my comment section. But also to help people out when it comes to playing the game, as some of these will actually have a massive impact on the way you play. So to start off with, let's talk about the biggest misconception that people still have, which is the fact that the best way to play the game is to build Doomstacks. Now, if you aren't familiar with what a Doomstack is, well, it is basically a really expensive army of high-tier units, which is usually just a spam of single entity monsters that is capable of taking on multiple enemy armies at the same time. These armies are basically unstoppable on the battlefield, except for some very rare situations where they actually can be beaten. The reason as to why this was ever even a thing dates back to Warhammer 2, where you had massive supply lines on the highest difficulty. And if you didn't know, supply lines means that you get a percentage increased upkeep of all of your units, based on the amount of armies you have. For Warhammer 2, on the highest difficulty, this was 15% per army, meaning that maintaining multiple armies was extremely taxing and, for most races, downright impossible. This made it so that the best way to play the game was to go for quality instead of quantity, to have a single army, be able to take on multiple enemy armies and not slow down. Thus the concept of Doomstacking was born. Currently, in Warhammer 3, the maximum supply lines you can get per army is 4%, which is nothing compared to Warhammer 2, and thus you have no real need to Doomstack. But this isn't the full story, as most of your low-tier units in this game are able to perform at an extremely high level, if properly supported by buffs and technologies. Take for instance a Goblin unit as opposed to a Black Orc, where a Goblin can have as much melee attack and melee defense, once decently buffed, as a Black Orc at a fraction of the cost. So these two things, lower supply lines and the ability to make low tier units extremely strong, while also being dirt cheap, means that the best way to play the game is to just spam out as many low tier armies as you possibly can and just conquer the world that way. So, whenever you hear people say that you are highly incentivized to build Doomstacks, you should know that they probably don't play the game enough to actually understand it, and are just going off of what used to be the best way to play back in Warhammer 2. The next misconception I see often is that melee combat is better than range combat, simply due to the fact that range units were nerfed in Warhammer 3 and don't work properly. And this one, well, it is true to an extent, isn't really the case, as it more depends on which race you're playing. So if you are playing as the Empire and your guns aren't working properly because of spaghetti code, they will in the end still do a better job at killing the enemy than a unit of greatswords would. But if you're playing something like the Greenskins, where you have a choice between a really powerful melee unit, I'm talking about the goblins of course, or some archers, well in that case the melee unit will be the more obvious choice. So this really is just dependent a lot on which race or faction you're playing as, and isn't the rule for the game as a whole. Then the next one is Herohammer, as in heroes are the most overpowered unit in the game and beat everything, making regular units worthless or obsolete. And this one is both true and not true, as everybody conveniently leaves out the part where you need levels and items to invest into a character before they can become ridiculously strong. A low-level melee hero, or even a somewhat leveled up melee hero, is usually going to lose against an actual unit on the battlefield, especially if they at the very least don't have some decent items to boost their defensive or offensive capabilities. A low-level spellcaster is usually going to be worse than a unit of goblin archers, as they only come online when they get their best spells and have enough winds of magic to cast them during the battle. So even a high-level spellcaster can be useless if you don't have the Winds of Magic to cast your battle-winning spells. Almost all ranged characters, no matter what level they are going to be absolutely worthless on the battlefield, as they just never deal any damage, and their worth usually comes from buffing units inside of its army or using abilities to debuff the enemy. So characters like these make your army better and aren't directly the reason why you will win battles. All of this is to say that characters have limits and aren't as overpowered as they are made out to be. Given the right items, enough levels, and the perfect conditions, they absolutely can be broken. But getting to that point usually takes a while, and they aren't the instant win people make them out to be. It would be like saying that empire building is OP, since eventually you will have enough income to support as many armies as you want. And I mean, let's be real, this game does have RPG elements in it, and like every RPG, the more you progress through the game, getting items and experience, the stronger you become. So it would be a bit weird if in this game your characters never got any stronger so that they don't hurt the feelings of standard units. Then we have the claim that Perfect Vigor is the best stat in the game. And if this was Warhammer 2, I would have agreed with you. But in Warhammer 3, Perfect Vigor actually isn't perfect. So to start from the beginning, what is Vigor? Well, it is the representation of your unit's fighting capabilities, based on how tired they are. The more a unit fights, the more tired it gets, and by getting tired, it starts to lose its stats, like melee attack, melee defense, armor, and so on. So when you start a battle, your unit is going to be fresh and ready to perform. But as the fight drags out, your unit starts getting weaker and weaker to the point where it will perform half as well as it would when it was fresh for combat. So Perfect Vigor makes it so that your units will never get tired and will always perform to their fullest. But unlike Warhammer 2, Perfect Vigor isn't perfect in Warhammer 3, as there are still ways you can lose Vigor both during a battle and on the campaign map. So in Warhammer 3, raiding or being in Force March will make your Vigor lower during the battle, even if your units have Perfect Vigor, which was not the case in Warhammer 2. And not only this, but any effects that lower your Vigor in a battle, such as the Lore of Plague passive, will still work on your Perfect Vigor units, which again wasn't the case in Warhammer 2. So even though Perfect Vigor should be one of the best things you can get in the game, it actually isn't perfect, and therefore it isn't actually as strong as people make it out to be. Then the next one is that there is a severe lack of strategy on the campaign map, which kinda depends on what you consider to be strategy. I have seen many people compare the Total War campaigns to that of Paradox games, and how in Paradox games you have an insane amount of options and mechanics, while in Total War you get the bare bones. And with this I do agree, but what I don't think is true is the fact that there is no strategy to be had on the campaign map, just because you lack the tools or mechanics. When playing the game, you constantly have to think about where you're going to expand, when and where you're going to invest your resources to build up settlements. If you expand towards an area you can't defend, well, it will easily be taken away from you. And if you invest in settlements that are exposed to enemy attack, well, then you will have just wasted your resources. Then you have to think about who you're fighting. For example, if you're fighting against the dwarves, then it is best that you bring armor-piercing anti-infantry units, but if you're fighting against the ogres, then you will need lots of range units or anti-large. Then the location at which you're fighting on the campaign map will determine the type of battlefield you will have. So if you have the option to choose where to fight and want to take advantage of your ranged heavy armies, for example, you could lead the enemy to a choke point battle by standing near river crossings or mountain passages. Alternatively, you will have to avoid fighting in these places if you have a cavalry-focused army and need as much room to maneuver on the battlefield as you can possibly get. Then you also have the option to draw out enemy armies by hiding your own armies in ambush stands or drawing the enemy away by force marching your armies past them. The campaign map isn't devoid of strategy, as there is so much that you can do in that regard. What it is devoid in is mechanics that games like Paradox games are known for, and I don't necessarily think that this is a bad thing, which is how people usually portray it. Instead, I think that the lack of mechanics is usually a good thing, so that you don't get overwhelmed by them, as the main focus of Total War games are their battles and not the campaign. Finally, I just wanted to dispel the notion that flying monsters and single entity monsters are the best and the most overpowered units in the game, that can completely win battles by themselves and ruin the dynamic of them, which is kind of not even close to being the case. And the reason for this is quite simple. There is a massive trade-off for these units. In the case of flying units, they have very little health and are extremely susceptible to missile attack, meaning that if you react fast enough when facing them, you will usually just outright kill them before they can even reach you. And if you're using a melee-focused army, well, if they engage your melee units, they will usually just die. Same goes for if you are using them. As for single entity monsters, it is very simple. They are much easier to kill than a regular unit, with a few exceptions. The reason for this is that single entity monsters are usually much larger than infantry, so they are much easier to shoot with your range units, even if they are engaged with you in melee. And they're much more susceptible to being hit by your melee infantry as well. This is because instead of having a one-on-one model fight with your infantry, where its stats will be taken into account in their fullest, the single entity is usually beset by multiple models of infantry from every angle, meaning that it will get hit in its back or rather be flanked by multiple models of infantry. And if you didn't know, flanking in this game means that a unit is more likely to be hit by a melee attack if it is getting hit in its back or its sides. And because of this, surrounding a single entity with melee infantry will usually result in that monster dying a lot faster and performing a lot worse than what you would expect it to. So units like these will always need a ton of support from other units in order to perform well, or alternatively be made a Doomstack out of, as these units are usually the best units to use when you want to make a Doomstack. Because one of these by itself is fairly weak, but if you get 10 of them side by side, well, then they will end up completely negating the advantage infantry will usually have. The people who usually say that these types of units are OP are people who don't actually play the game, or people who prefer historical titles and absolutely despise the existence of units that break the traditional rock, paper, scissors balance of infantry, ranged, and cavalry. And these would be the biggest misconceptions I read or hear about non-stop. Now, there are a lot more than just this, but these were the main ones I wanted to talk about. If you guys know of any I missed, or just have some you would like to share, do so in the comments, as I am genuinely curious to hear about them. Anyways, if you enjoyed the video and would like to watch more of these, don't forget to subscribe for future content. Thank you all for watching, and until next time.
Khorne fights as one.